My name is Kevin Lundberg. I serve in the state senate in Colorado, and I, along with Representative Yvette Harrell, are the co-chairs for the Article 5 caucus, which we are launching in order to pursue the goal of really putting our nation back in order in so many ways, because Congress is so much out of control. How many of you were at the luncheon just a few minutes ago? I've been attending ALEC events for the last 11 years, and I have never seen such focused passion on the part of speakers for the problems that we're confronting right now. Not just the organization for the American Legislative Exchange Council, but for the very concept of free people and free markets. And I believe that as we confront these issues, that we as state legislators have an opportunity and the responsibility to take control of the proper system of federalism that was established by our nation's founders. And we've gotten so far astray to that DC is completely out of control. If you've been in the legislature for long, in a state legislature, you know that 9/10 of what you're doing is you're reacting to and indeed following the directions of Congress. Now, where do you see that in the Constitution? It doesn't exist. But we have the ability to take it back, I believe, and much of it is through the efforts that we're going to see here today, as well as allow me to simply briefly invite you and possibly introduce you to the Article 5 caucus, which will be meeting in this hotel on Saturday immediately following the ALEC convention. I've got some little flyers here that are just an announcement of that. You might pick one up, and I know some people will be flying out earlier. You know, we're going to pack as much as we can in at the front end. It starts at 8:30 on Saturday, and attendance, at first there was a cost, but I want to thank some generous donations that have occurred largely from the project of Citizens for Self-Governance. I have to look back there so I get all the words right.
By the end of the day, I'm sure you'll have that.
We'll get it right, CSG. But they're helping out as well to make it available to all of us to attend this launching of the Article 5 caucus on Saturday. And as I say, we've got some announcements here and try to remind you that at the end. But right now, we're going to dig into the details, get into the real systems of what we're talking about and some of the background. And it's my privilege to moderate, but that doesn't mean I'm the expert. The experts indeed are at the table here. And we have three gentlemen, Mr. Mark Meckler with Citizens for Self-Governance, I believe you're the president.
Yes.
And then Mr. Michael Farris with, the title says Homeschool Legal Defense Association, but it's a little more detailed than that, complex than that. And then Professor Rob Natelson, and I'll get to all the introductions, but let me start with Mike Farris, who will be speaking first. And I've actually known Mike for the last 20 years. It actually was through the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, but he went on to establish Patrick Henry College. He is a constitutional scholar of his own right, has actually argued many significant issues over the last several decades, and has had a tremendous impact for freedom and values in our country. And it's a real pleasure and privilege for me to introduce to you Mr. Michael Farris. And you've got 25 minutes.
Okay. Great, thank you. Thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate all of you coming this afternoon. This is an exciting opportunity to face a very difficult and desperate problem, a nation that is simply out of control because of Washington, D.C. And so I want to start with a simple but important proposition. Washington, D.C. is addicted to power, spending, and debt. It has its own best interest as its highest priority, and no matter which party is in control, the addiction to power and the abuse of the Constitution goes on unchecked. Now, in some venues, I'd have to prove these statements, but for this audience, I'm just going to proceed on the basis that you, like Thomas Jefferson, would hold that these truths are self-evident. Or for those more acquainted with Bart Simpson, you might say that Washington, D.C. is broken as well, like duh. It's the same idea, different lingo for different eras. The public recognizes that there's a mess. The abysmal approval ratings for Congress are not without justification. Members of the public know that something is seriously amiss, but they really don't know how to analyze the specifics of the problem, nor is there a readily apparent solution. The crushing intergenerational debt, a government that spies on all of its citizens and justifies that spying as being in the public's self-interest, regulations that hamper business development and steal our freedom to create jobs, and the ever-present runaway government spending, not for the purpose of the long-range good of the nation, but the spending is simply done to reassure the election of political incumbents. These are just the elements of the problem, but they all arise from a common core. And that core is this: America, at least the Washington, D.C. version of America, no longer believes and no longer follows its first principles. The founders believed in limited government. Washington, D.C. believes in the growth of its power. The founders believed in genuine checks and balances between the branches. Washington, D.C. practices collusion between the federal branches. No federal court has ruled since 1936 that Congress has violated its power to tax and spend. 1936 is the last time. And that year was the famous threat by FDR to increase the size of the Supreme Court, to pack the court with a phalanx of New Deal advocates. The court then changed its mind about how to interpret the Constitution. And the New Deal was Congress could legislate as long as it pleased, so long as Congress then let the court manipulate the Constitution as it pleased. That's the deal. Presidents and executive branch agencies legislate despite the fact that in Article 1, Section 1, it says all legislative power is vested in the Congress of the United States. Congress uses an utterly anti-historical view of the General Welfare Clause to do indirectly what it could never do directly, that is, force state legislatures to adopt policies and laws that Congress wants, rather than the policies and laws that the state's own voters want. The Supreme Court repeatedly declares the following maxim, and this statement is at least in a dozen Supreme Court decisions, and I quote to you directly: "The only check upon our exercise of power is our own sense of self-restraint." Why is this being allowed to happen? Well, the people have forgotten the principle that our founders knew well. If the people do not force government to stay strictly within its delegated authority, government will become the master rather than the servant. The public distrust of government arises from a subconscious realization that we're slowly losing our status as sovereign citizens and are incrementally on the path to becoming subservient subjects to an all-powerful government. If we think that the solution to the underlying problem is to adopt one or two specific policy proposals that will be wiser and more sustainable, we're sadly missing the point. The ultimate problem is not money. The problem is power. Washington, D.C. is exercising power that the founders never gave any government, much less the federal government. And don't take my word for that conclusion. Here's what the Supreme Court said in a majority opinion in a case where they approved the exercise of power, despite the fact that, as you're going to see, they said it was anti-historical for them to do so. Here's the direct quotation. "This framework has been sufficiently flexible over the past 2 centuries to allow for enormous changes in the nature of the government. The federal government undertakes activities today that would have been unimaginable to the framers in 2 senses. First, because the framers would not have conceived that any government would conduct such activities. And second, because the framers would not have believed that the federal government, rather than the states, would assume such responsibilities. Yet the powers conferred upon the federal government by the Constitution were phrased in language broad enough to allow for the expansion of the federal government's role. For those of you keeping score, that was from the majority opinion in New York versus the United States in 1992, when they upheld this federal expansion of power. Ladies and gentlemen, Washington, D.C. is abusing its power and enslaving our children and our grandchildren in unsustainable debt. And the people are so frustrated with this abuse of power that serious people are starting to talk about concepts like nullification and even secession. Nullification is a vain pursuit. There are over 200 volumes of the Code of Federal Registry, federal regulations, and there are hundreds of volumes of the United States Code. To effectively nullify it, you'd need to nullify all of the Code of Federal Registry and about 80% of the U.S. Code. And if you could get one state to nullify one law, that'd be a pretty good deal. It wouldn't be very effective, but it'd be a pretty good deal. And to get 50 states to nullify volumes and volumes is just simply not a realistic idea. Secession is a worse idea. Sensible people know that secession is an act of political revolution that invariably leads to violence. Revolution can be justified under certain circumstances, but not when the Constitution itself gives us a path to stop the abuse of power by Washington, D.C. If we have a perfectly legal path to stop the abuses of the federal government and we refrain from using it, we have no basis to claim, and certainly no more justification for even entertaining ideas like nullification or secession. As the people in this room certainly know, at least in general terms, the founders gave us a solution to stop the abuses of a federal government that's drunk with power. Article 5 of the Constitution authorizes states enacting entirely on their own with no need for permission from Washington, D.C. at all to adopt constitutional changes which will definitively and effectively restrict the power of the federal government. The Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy gives us the relevant historical background to Article 5, and I quote, "On September 15th, as the convention was reviewing the revisions made by the Committee of Style, George Mason expressed opposition to the provisions limiting the power to propose amendments to the Congress." In other words, not Congress alone should have the power to propose amendments. According to the convention records, Mason thought that no amendments of the proper kind would ever be obtained by the people if the government, meaning the federal government, should become oppressive, as he verily believed would be the case. In response, Gouverneur Morris and Elbridge Gerry made a motion to amend the article, that's Article 5, to reintroduce language requiring that the convention be called whenever 2/3 of the states applied for an amendment. There you have it. When the federal government becomes oppressive, George Mason's leadership ensured that the state legislatures would be the safeguards of the liberty of the people. State legislatures have the power to protect the liberty of the people, and I would respectfully suggest that you all also have the moral obligation to do so whenever the circumstance is warranted. And if this government is not the enemy of liberty and the agency of oppression, particularly when viewed in the light of our children and our grandchildren, I don't know what would suffice. Again, as the Supreme Court said itself over 20 years ago, the federal government is engaged in activities the founders would have never imagined any government pursuing, and especially not the federal government. And I respectfully submit that in the past 20 years, we've gone rapidly in the wrong direction, not in the right direction. It's time, it's high time. I just hope it's not too late. While it won't be easy to write all the detailed legislation that'll be necessary to walk us back from the brink of collapse, I think actually the structural changes that are necessary to save the Republic are pretty easy to identify as long as we know the original design is intended by the founders. The vast majority of the abuses of power by the federal government are bound up in false interpretations of the General Welfare Clause and the Commerce Clause. So for just a few minutes, I'm going to take you inside my constitutional law class that I teach at Patrick Henry College and teach you about principally the General Welfare Clause. The overarching principle for both of these clauses can be summed up in this idea. Neither clause authorizes the sharing of concurrent jurisdiction between the federal government and the states. Each is an exclusive grant of power, and that leads to a very simple set of rules. If the states can spend money on a topic, then the federal government cannot spend money on that same topic. If the federal government can regulate activity under the Commerce Clause, then the states cannot regulate that activity at all. But the converse is also true. If the activity is something that the states can regulate legitimately under the Constitution, then the Commerce Clause grants no power at all to the federal government on that subject matter. So let's review some of the more important details now that you understand the framework. The realistic modern view of the General Welfare Clause rather, from the Supreme Court and from the way Congress practices it is this: Congress can spend money on any fool thing it wants. That's the real rule of the General Welfare Clause. There are no limits on congressional spending power. This view has emerged from the 1936 case of United States versus Butler. In that case, the Supreme Court faced the most important fiscal decision ever made by that body. The case involved the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was the forerunner of our modern farm subsidy programs. Congress justified the taxing and spending for this purpose under the General Welfare Clause. And the precise legal issue before the Supreme Court was this: whether the General Welfare Clause was a separate grant of spending power, as Alexander Hamilton argued, or whether it was a mere summation of the other enumerated powers of Congress, as James Madison argued. In other words, can Congress spend money for purposes beyond its enumerated powers? That's another way of asking the same exact question. In a remarkably short discussion, it's actually about that much of a page, about 3 inches on a page, the Supreme Court sided with Hamilton without anything like a proper explanation of the basis for the decision. It's almost like the Supreme Court was too busy to give us their full answer. I've long wondered, or actually I had long wondered, what information the court had before it to convince him to follow the Hamilton view rather than the Madison view. About 4 years ago, Patrick Henry College acquired a database of all the briefs and records of the Supreme Court cases for about 100 years. And the second case I downloaded all the records for was the Butler case, because I've just wanted to know this for a long time. There was only one brief filed on the historical issues. It was by the FDR Justice Department. It was fascinating. I read that not only, I knew parts of what they said, Madison had company in holding his view of a limited view of the General Welfare Clause. Thomas Jefferson held the same view. But I also learned that Hamilton had company as well. George Washington supported the Hamilton view, and so did Monroe. He supported the Hamilton view. And then they went a little deeper in history and said that Daniel Webster supported the Hamilton view, and the one that just floored me was John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun, or so this brief said, supported the Hamilton view, which has been interpreted to mean the federal government can spend money on any fool thing it wants. I just knew there was something wrong. John C. Calhoun, the great states' right advocate, would not have believed that. So I drilled down to their original sources and looked them all up and read them in context. And they were right. John C. Calhoun did support the Hamilton view. But what was misrepresented was Hamilton's view. Hamilton's view, and you can find it in detail in Joseph Story's commentaries on the Constitution, was this. And it stems from the very first resolution passed at the Constitutional Convention. The federal government was being given power only where the areas where the states were jurisdictionally incompetent. So the Hamilton view of the General Welfare Clause is this. States can pass laws, the federal government can tax and spend for purposes beyond the other enumerated powers, provided two things. Congress concludes that it's in the national interest and not a local interest and not somebody's personal interest, and that the states have no jurisdiction to spend money on that topic. So it's really simple to figure out how you apply this. And that would make sense with John C. Calhoun's view. Can the states spend money on education? Well, yes. Can the federal government? No. Can the states spend money on welfare? Yes. Can the federal government? No. Can the states spend money on health care? Yes. Can the federal government? No. Anything that the states have jurisdiction to spend money on, the federal government cannot spend money on it under the Hamilton view. And everybody knows they couldn't do it under the Madison view. There's only 2 examples in all of U.S. history where there's a practical difference in the outcome between Hamilton and Madison. One is purchases, like the Louisiana purchase, the Gadsden purchase, the Alaska purchase. When the federal government bought land to expand the United States, Jefferson, holding to that view, thought it was unconstitutional, but he did it anyway because it's so important. But under the Hamilton view, it was perfectly constitutional because it was for the national interest, and it was something the states couldn't do. The states couldn't buy territory from a foreign country to expand the United States. That's the Hamilton explanation. The other is the space program. There's no enumerated power that would justify the space program, but I think pretty clearly it fits the general welfare clause. It is for the national interest, and it's something the states cannot do. So there you have it. It's a really simple rule, and that's the overarching plan of the federal government. The Commerce Clause, by the way, means the same thing in reverse. If the states can regulate it, the federal government can't. The states, can regulate banking. The Uniform Commercial Code, Article 2 and 3, regulates banking. The federal government can't regulate banking, not under the Commerce Clause anyway, because Commerce Clause is a grant of exclusive power. If it's Commerce Clause, the states can't regulate it at all. So what we learn, banking's not commerce. Commerce is shipping stuff. The FAA is a legitimate Commerce Clause power. Planes across state lines, that's commerce. Greyhound buses across state lines, trucking across state lines. It's shipping stuff. That's it. Not manufacturing, not mining, not banking, not all things economic. That's the states. Commerce is the exclusive power of the federal government to make sure that we don't get in trade wars with each other on shipping across state lines. That is exclusively the power. There is no current jurisdiction on any amendment in the U.S. or any subject in the U.S. Constitution that I know of except one. The 21st Amendment gives Congress and the states concurrent jurisdiction on the regulation of alcohol. Otherwise, it's either the federal government or the states. And if the states can regulate it, the Congress cannot. That's the rule that we should have. Now, we need to fix the broad constitutional language that the Supreme Court has declared in that case I quoted to you from, that says it's broad enough for the federal government to grow beyond the intentions of the founders and change the language so that there's no longer any wiggle room. Similarly, the solutions here for both of these areas are a constitutional amendment saying very specifically, Congress cannot regulate any activity or spend money for any purpose that's not within their own legitimate subject matter, and the states are in possession of all the legitimate subject matter of the domestic areas except those explicitly enumerated things that are in the text of the Constitution. All of these rules, if we do these correctly, if we follow the original meaning and adopt new constitutional language to reinstitute the original meaning, we don't have unfunded mandates from the states. We don't have mandates on the states at all. None. Zero zip. Every bit of that is unconstitutional. As a matter of political theory, it is a denial of the Republican form of government to have federal mandates. Because the voters of California, New York, and Massachusetts, let's say, can get together and pull a few other people out of a certain group of states. And those voters could put people in Congress that put mandates on all the other states. And the people that you represent aren't represented in those elections. It is a denial of the Republican form of government because only the people who you are responsible to should be the voters of your state. You should not have to implement the will of the voters of any other state. And all federal mandates violate the principle of Republican form of government because you're being forced to implement the will of voters from other states. We've got to stop this denial of the basic theory of American self-government. Now, if we would just fix those particular things, the nation would be changed. But there are other things we could do. We could stop the abuse of the federal regulatory process. All laws are supposed to be passed by Congress, not by the bureaucrats. They should have no power to enact regulations. None, zero, zip, none. not a runaway regulation, no regulations that control private property or private land. Executive orders are out of control. There's all manner of things that we could do. If we had an Article 5 Convention of the States to restrict the power of the federal government, which is what we're calling for. On Article 8 of this booklet, the Convention of the States booklet that we've given you here from Citizens for Self-Governance, there is the draft application for an Article 5 Convention of the States that I drafted and Rob Natelson, who will follow me, has edited and helped me with. And the rule of germaneness that is embedded in here says that any amendment, whether it's a balanced budget amendment, a tax limitation amendment, an exclusive jurisdiction amendment that stops all this misuse of the Commerce Clause and the General Welfare Clause, stops regulatory abuse, all these other things, all of that would be germane. Mark Levin is announcing a new book. It's coming out next week. I've seen an advanced copy of it. He has 11 amendments. 10 of his amendments would be germane under our application. The balanced budget amendment, all the amendments of the Article 5 community are promoting today would be germane under this application. And we go to the floor of the convention, we debate these, we see which ones get a majority of the states to support in an Article 5 Convention of the States. We go back, then 38 states ratify. It is a state-controlled process. The states vote as states in such a convention. And what's been missing from this and what we intend to bring to this is the grassroots mobilization that needs to put this over the top. The Article 5 efforts that have gone to the floor for votes so far have faced an inappropriate amount of political opposition without a countervailing public groundswell of support for the process of a convention of the states, the process of using Article 5 to overcome the power of the federal government. And frankly, it's misinformed fear about the founding fathers that's driving this. In your booklet is an article that I've written on the historical fallacy that the original Constitution was a runaway convention. It's just not true. It is not true. It is an anti-historical argument always made by the enemies of the Constitution. And I just don't get the logic of people saying we don't want to use Article 5 because it might destroy our precious Constitution, which, by the way, our precious Constitution was illegally adopted. Well, if they don't like the Constitution, if it was illegally adopted, why is it precious? Our Constitution was not illegally adopted, and we need to use the Constitution to save the nation. And the Constitution gives you all, as state legislators, that power. Citizens for Self-Governance in our Convention of the States process is going to build a grassroots network. I've been building grassroots networks through the homeschooling community for 30 plus years. I know how to build grassroots networks. We're going to have 3,000 legislative district captains. That's 75% of the districts in the 40 states that we're targeting. There are a few states, we're going to be accepting help in all states, but there are a few states that are not really viable targets. Massachusetts, California, you get the idea. But in 40 states, we're going to have district captains in 75% of your districts. That's 3,000 captains. We're going to have at least 100 supporters of the Convention of the States in each of those 3,000 districts. We're going to have at least 25 people from every one of those 75% of the districts that will volunteer to show up at the legislative hearings. And so if the other side produces 100 against a Convention of the States, we're going to have 1,000 or 2,000. And we're going to make sure that our people understand the importance of volunteering for the campaigns of legislators that will vote and support a Convention of the States or candidates opposing those who vote against the Convention of the States. We are going to make sure that people who stand up for liberty on this issue, we're going to have your back. We're going to have your back with volunteers. We're going to have your back with bundling operations. We're going to have your back. And so we're going to bring the grassroots organizational technique that has made the Tea Party movement with Mark and the homeschooling movement that I've had a part in for 30 years. And you all know that we know how to organize and we know how to turn out the grassroots. We're going to do it for this. And we're going to make sure that the public is educated, and that when the public is educated and turned out, they're going to stand up, they're going to speak up, and they're going to back you when you lead. This is a chance for state legislators to do the most important thing that has ever been done in at least 100 years in this country: win back our liberty. And I think that last week I gave a speech on this in the Allegheny Mountains, and a 10-year-old girl raised her hand when I was done and said, "What can I do to help?" And I said, "You could be my biggest asset. I need you to go look every adult you know in the eye and say this: why should I spend half or more of my family income for all of my life paying for things you're buying for yourselves today? What moral justification can you give for stealing my liberty for this purpose?" You go look them in the eye and tell them the only thing we can do to stop Washington, D.C. is to call a convention of the states. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to unleash an army of 10-year-olds in this country through the homeschooling movement. And you know good and well we can get them, we can train them, and they are going to look people in the eye and say, we deserve to have liberty too. The Constitution says our duty was to preserve liberty for ourselves and our posterity. There is no constitutional basis for mandates from the federal government to the states. There is a complete constitutional basis for the states mandating the federal government to stop the runaway abuses of power. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Much to be said, very little time to say it in, so I'll try to be quick in introducing our next presenter. He's Rob Natelson is one of America's best-known constitutional scholars. For 23 years, he served as professor of law at the University of Montana, where he taught constitutional law and became a recognized national expert on the framing and adoption of the United States Constitution. I'll be brief here and simply say that Rob currently serves as the Senior Fellow in Constitutional Jurisprudence at the Independence Institute in Colorado. He is a Senior Fellow in Constitutional Jurisprudence at the Montana Policy Institute in Bozeman, Montana, and Senior Fellow at the Goldwater Institute in Phoenix, Arizona. He is the author of the ALEC book, Handbook for State Lawmakers Proposing Constitutional Amendments. He's here today. Rob, please come and tell us what you can. And hopefully we're going to carve out just a few minutes for questions at the end of our session. Thank you, Rob.
It's a real honor to talk to you today with some of my favorite people in the world. My job is to give you kind of a thumbnail sketch of what this process is all about. I will tell you, though, offhand or up front, that I did not get into this with the idea of becoming an expert on Article 5. As a constitutional scholar, one of the things I do is I go through the Constitution looking for parts of the document that have been either not written much about or the stuff out there is not very good. And boy, was that ever true of Article 5. Not only wasn't there very much stuff written, but it actually wasn't very good. And so what I did is I became immersed in the history and the background. I used to believe, for example, that the convention called under Article 5 was a constitutional convention. I was wrong. I used to believe that there was a runaway danger. I was wrong. I simply learned, well, you know how they say, it isn't the things that you don't know, it's the things that you do know that are but that aren't true that are the problem. And that was my problem. All the things that I thought I knew about this process just weren't true. Now, let's start off with just a little bit of historical background so you can see where this thing came from. Today we tend to think of the Constitutional Convention as a one-of-a-kind, unique sort of event. Something like that never happened before or ever happened again. One of the surprises that I learned about was that that wasn't true. That in fact it was really common during the 17th and 18th century for colonies and states to meet together in conventions. Before our independence was declared, various colonies had met together in conventions about 20 times. And after independence was declared, there were 10 meetings of states before the Constitutional Convention. I also learned that many of the people at the Constitutional Convention themselves had an extensive history of convention going. And so that when they write into the Constitution the phrase convention for proposing amendments, they knew exactly what they were talking about. Hamilton, Madison, John Dickinson, Roger Sherman, etc., John Rutledge, virtually all the most influential delegates at the Constitutional Convention had had extensive experience with prior interstate conventions. They understood exactly what they were about. They also understood that there were certain common protocols that were followed at all these conventions. When I got into reading the articles about the subject, I realized that, they didn't have a clue. I mean, they asked questions like, how do we choose the delegates? And how many delegates are there going to be from every state? And how are the delegates going to be apportioned? And yet the founding era record gives us all of that information because the protocols were worked out over a period of more than a century before the Constitutional Convention ever met. For example, we know that a federal convention is a meeting of the states. It was regularly referred to as a convention of the states. The Supreme Court has used the same term, convention of the states. It's not some mass body of representatives from the people generally like the House of Representatives. It is instead a meeting, a diplomatic meeting of representatives from the various state legislatures. These representatives are called commissioners, and each delegation sent from every state is called a committee. And each committee gets one vote. California's committee gets one vote, New York's committee gets one vote, Rhode Island's committee gets one vote, Wyoming's committee gets one vote, and so forth. The convention makes its own rules, it elects its own officers. We also know that this convention was designed by the framers as a way of getting around Congress in case Congress ever became abusive or oppressive, which of course we know could never happen. Mike Farris referred to the memorable moment at the Constitutional Convention when George Mason, one of the greatest delegates, stood up and said, this government could become abusive and the people have got to find a way to rein it in. The founders saw this method as the primary way, or a primary way, in which the people acting through their state legislatures could check the federal government and bring it back to its constitutional limits and end oppressions. That was its purpose. That's why it was put in. The power that you as state legislators have to do this is not given to you by your reserved power of the states. We think of the 10th Amendment, all power is not delegated or reserved to the states. The power that you have to save the country, because that's what the power is, the power that you have to save the country is given to you by the people of the United States through the Constitution. When you act to apply to Congress for a convention on a particular topic or topics, when you act to ratify amendments, when the convention acts, all those bodies act pursuant to enumerated powers granted them by the Constitution. It follows, of course, that you can't do anything contrary to the Constitution. And by the way, the authority for that proposition is not just the founding era. The authority for that proposition is a series of cases decided by the United States Supreme Court in the 20th century. Another thing I learned in this little course of discovery that I underwent is that we've actually already had a dry run for a convention for proposing amendments. We've already done it once. In 1861, when it looked like the country was going to be riven by civil war, when several southern states had already seceded, the great Commonwealth of Virginia, anyone here from Virginia? Yeah. The great Commonwealth of Virginia called a convention for Washington, D.C. And the purpose of this convention was to propose a constitutional amendment or amendments to stave off civil war. Now, this was not an Article 5 convention because it was not called as a result of applications by the states, but it was essentially the equivalent. It was a dry run for it. The chairman of the convention who was selected was former President of the United States, John Tyler. The vast majority of states that had not yet seceded met in Washington. They drafted an amendment. They voted according to the protocol of one state, one vote. They followed all the protocols that the founders anticipated for the convention for proposing amendments. And they came up with a constitutional amendment which, if adopted, might very well have staved off the Civil War, saved 600,000 American lives, and, by the way, because of the way the amendment was drafted, put slavery on the route to extinction. Unfortunately, because this convention could not present directly to the states, it offered the amendment to Congress, which did nothing. Congress did nothing while the country was being torn apart, just as Congress is doing nothing to deal with the overreaching federal government today. Now, let me just finish up here by making a few points regarding the runaway scenario. The claim that if we ever had a convention like this, it could be a constitutional convention which could do anything it wants, careen out of control, take over the country, presumably come and kill all of your puppies, whatever. There are far, far more controls over this convention than there are over the runaway Congress. For example, when the states offer 34 applications on any one particular subject, the convention is limited to the scope of those applications. Secondly, when Congress exercised its mandatory duty to call the convention after having received 34 applications on one subject, it follows those applications and specifies the scope of the convention. The convention may not go beyond that. Each convention committee, each state delegation, is chosen by the state legislature in such manner as the state legislature shall direct. That means that each member of the convention is recallable by the state legislatures, a well-recognized prerogative of the states meeting in convention. They are also under instructions from the state legislature. This is a convention for the purpose of Amendment X. It's not for the convention of purpose of Amendment Y. You start talking about Amendment Y, we're going to call you home. If by some miraculous event the convention were to come up with an amendment not authorized, then Congress would have the right, in fact the duty, to refuse to specify a mode of ratification. And since Congress is an institutional rival of the convention, it'll have every motive to try to rein in the convention if the convention acts in any way which is impermissible. And then there is the requirement that not 1, not 4, not 14, but 38 states ratify any amendment proposed by the convention. Could the convention change the method of ratification? No. Because, as I've already said, the United States Supreme Court says that the convention is empowered by the Constitution and subject to its rules. And if all of that wasn't enough, I would like to remind you that there are other possibilities of lawsuits all along the line. Anything that the convention does that is even arguably legal can and will be challenged in the courts. And contrary to what you may have heard, the courts have been willing to accept Article 5 disputes, and there is a long line of court decisions that shed light on Article 5. So the real risks are not from the runaway convention. The real risks are that we won't have a convention. The state legislatures may not act, and the federal government may continue to careen out of control. The convention may deadlock, like, for example, the Yorktown Convention of 1777 did when they had a tie vote among the states. The convention may not act, and the United States Congress may continue to careen out of control. The convention may propose, but then the states refuse to ratify, and Congress continue out of control. Or liberal groups might very well sue to try to throw a monkey wrench into the convention and with the same results. But we do have the obligation to act. Let me just suggest to you one possible vignette in closing here. Let's suppose that contrary to all expectations, the door were to open from the back, and in strode James Madison and John Dickinson. And after we all gasped and wondered how they got there, we all mobbed around them to talk to them. And several of us started complaining to them about what the federal government had become. That had become a government that had snapped its powers, its scope of its powers a long time ago. That had become a government that had burdened us with incredible debt. That had become a government that often was oppressive and couldn't even balance its own budget. And when we outlined all those problems to Mr. Dickinson and Mr. Madison, what would be their response? Their response would be, well, have you used the procedure in Article 5 that we wrote into the Constitution for exactly that eventuality? And when we sheepishly admitted that, no, we hadn't, we'd allowed ourselves to be distracted by alarmists and quacks, and we'd never really done it. No doubt, they would look at us and say that the situation was our own fault. And they would be right.
Our final presenter is Mark Meckler. He's the founder and president of Citizens for Self-Governance, an organization created to support grassroots activism in taking power from Washington, D.C., and returning it to its rightful owners, the citizens of the states. Mark co-founded and was formerly the national coordinator for the Tea Party Patriots, the largest Tea Party organization in the nation. He left that organization in February of 2009 and founded CSG to work more broadly on expanding the self-governance movement beyond the partisan divide. Mark?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
It's incredibly inspiring to stand up here and see all of you out there. You know, I have to say 4.5 years ago, when I started my journey in politics, a total political novice, just a guy living on ranch property up in the hills in Northern California, I had a general disdain for politicians. Sorry to admit that in this room. And my opinion has dramatically changed over the years. I won't tell you that I don't have a general disdain for most politicians, because I do, but I also realize that there are people like you all across the country on the front lines who actually are brave enough to put themselves on the front lines, who actually sit down with their families and make the decision that you're willing to go out there and fight the fight, first to be elected, to face that kind of scrutiny, to face that kind of abuse and negativism in the press. It's truly amazing, and I salute you guys for having the wherewithal to do that. Thank you guys very much. A hand for you guys personally. It's really important. That being said, and I think it's already been said here today, we come to you today to tell you that you have an incredible power to save the country. Along with that power, I would propose respectfully that you have a moral responsibility to save the country. Congress is clearly out of control. I don't think anybody in this room would disagree with that. I'd like to do a short survey. I do this at every room I speak in around the country, and I speak at conservative events, Tea Party events, libertarian events, progressive events. I always do this little survey when I speak, and I'm always amazed at the answers. So I'd like to ask you guys, please raise your hand, don't be embarrassed. If you personally, when you voted for your member of Congress or voted for president, voted for continuing $1 trillion plus deficits, raise your hand, please. Not one? You know, I haven't found that person, by the way, anywhere in the country. I'm talking tens of thousands of people. How about raise your hand if you think that we currently have an education system overseen by the federal government that is second to none, and every dollar goes spot on where it belongs to the kids. Raise your hands if you believe that. Still, not one person in the country, anywhere I go. And I'm talking the most liberal events in the country. I'm talking a MoveOn.org event, okay? Not one person. Raise your hand if you believe that in this country the war on drugs has been a tremendous success and we have the best criminal justice system in the world. Nobody. So what's the disconnect? And we're all sitting in this room, and you all and me and all of our fellow citizens, or the great majority of us, believe that we want to see certain things done by our government. We want to see our government get their hands off of certain things, and no matter who we vote for. Seems like whether we vote for Republicans in Congress, whether we vote for Democrats in Congress, we get more of the same. The charade in Washington, D.C. continues. The fight continues in Washington, D.C. in the media. The talking heads continue the fight. And in the end, we get the same thing we've always got, which is we get less liberty, less freedom, and less money in our pocketbooks. It's out of control. Over 60% of the American public today says that the federal government has lost the consent of the governed. Think of that. That's an extraordinary number. By the way, in case you're not doing the math in your head, those are not all conservative Republicans, right? 73% of Americans say that the federal government is too big, too involved in our lives, and spends too much money. Again, not all conservative Republicans. Those are extraordinary numbers, and they reflect the fact that Washington, D.C. is most definitely out of control. And it's been this way for a very long time. 4.5 years ago, we saw this spontaneous movement called the Tea Party develop. And I was one of the people who just happened to come out of the woodwork in the beginning and say, I just can't take it anymore. No involvement in politics, right? None at all. I'd never given to a candidate. I'd never walked a precinct. I'd never volunteered for anything political. I was interested, like so many of my fellow citizens, but I was busy raising my family. I had a career. I was focused on things at home, like hopefully we should be able to be. But at that moment in time, I realized that I had an obligation to my own kids. At that time, my kids were 10 and 13 years old, roughly, and I looked at them and I realized I was absolutely on the current trajectory, not going to give them a country as free or with as much opportunity as I had. And it wasn't because of some outside force. It was because of my own government. And I realized, along with millions of other Americans in that moment, probably many of you, that I had an obligation to do something. And so we stepped up and we started fighting the Tea Party fight. And we were pretty excited and very naive, right? So we went out and we fought in elections all across the country. And in 2010, in Congress, we saw the biggest party wave change since 1938. Incredible. We were euphoric across the country. And we thought and we believed widely that we would see tremendous change in Washington, D.C. What have we seen in Washington, D.C. since 2010? Much change? You guys seen a lot of change? Not much change. We've seen more of the same. We've seen continuing trillion-dollar deficits. We've seen the federal government continue to grow. We've seen Obamacare stay in place 4 years later, despite the fact that 53% of the American public want it repealed. What we see is the federal government continues to spiral out of control. The ship is headed for the rocks. We all know that. Those folks in D.C., they're the captains of this ship, and they are driving it right onto the rocks, and they will continue to put that ship on the rocks. They will continue to sink it, and they will continue to profit from the mess unless we stop them. Are you guys in agreement with that? So how do we stop them? What do we do? Well, it turns out, as you've heard from folks who know a lot more about it than I do, that the Constitution gives us a mechanism, and I believe with it, a responsibility for stopping runaway government in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago, I had the privilege of hosting at Harvard Law School. Yeah, and believe it or not, they let guys like me at Harvard Law School. And I hosted with a progressive constitutional law professor, Larry Lessig, a conference on the idea of an Article 5 convention. And I was pretty much neutral. I just thought, I don't know if this would do anything. I wasn't scared of it. I wasn't a runaway convention guy, but I just didn't see that it would solve our problems. And then I had the privilege of meeting up with Mike Farris. And Mike laid out the plan that you heard, that we got 75% of your districts, right? That's roughly 3,000 districts around the country, 100 activists in each district willing to participate, 25 willing to go to hearings. And I saw in Mike a man who knew how to build a movement like that, who had done it historically over the long haul. I knew that I'd been involved in building a movement like that in the Tea Party, and I knew that we could bring those networks to bear to pressure the country, to pressure people who were against it, to hold a convention to restore our God-given rights. And that's exactly what we intend to do. Here's the deal. The Army is out there. You've seen them perform. You know they're out there. You know what the homeschool movement did, right? I mean, they protected our right to educate our own children in the way we see fit, and they've done it successfully all over the country for a long time. You saw what the Tea Party movement did. You understand the power of grassroots, and you know that when you stand and you take a position, you need them there. And you know how lonely it is, because I'm sure all of you have done it, in the times when you do stand and you think they're there and you turn around and nobody's there, right? We're not going to let that happen to you. We're here with the resources, we're here with the network, we're here with the plan, and we are here for the long term. And our goal is nothing short of using the Constitution to give us that peaceful revolution that we need to put the people back in control of the country. Are you guys with me in doing that? You know, there are a lot of great people in history, and as I look back in history, there's somebody that's always looking over my shoulder. And I'm not a big one for idolizing the great men and women of history, but I can't help but hear Ronald Reagan's positive optimism, and I listen to his speeches all the time when I run. He was such an incredible communicator of sometimes complex ideas in words and with a rhetoric that simple guys like me can understand. And when I'm running through the woods near my house, I like to listen to those things, and I'm really inspired by those things. And he said something, I've been listening to his speech, the speech, right? Some people call it Time for Choosing 1960, Elevating Goldwater for President. And he said that we here right now have a rendezvous with destiny, you and I. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, will we preserve for our children this last best hope on earth? Or will we sentence them to take the first steps into 1,000 years of darkness? I personally will fight forever, whatever it takes, how long it takes, to prevent my children and your children and our posterity from taking those steps into darkness. We will persevere, we will get an Article 5 convention, and we will restrain the federal government. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for all of the panelists for being on time. Give us a few minutes for some questions, some interaction. So if somebody, we've got a couple of microphones here. If you want to step up and ask a question, please do. Go ahead.
Ron Mueller, Director of the Natelson Coalition. And what some of you may not know is that when Ed Meese was Reagan's Attorney General, he proposed the idea of giving states the power to do this safely without the risk of a runaway convention. And so what you are and we are all doing here is completing the Reagan Revolution, the unfinished work of the Reagan Revolution. You're all to be congratulated for the extraordinary work that you're doing. My question is that with Natelson Coalition, we've gone around and talked to state legislators and governors around the country and tried to find an issue that would unite the different wings of the conservative movement, add moderate Democrats, and be attractive to swing voters. And the one thing we continue to hear is the outrage at the president's use of the regulatory power to completely override any kind of checks and balances on his power. And so a number of legislators, including Representative Copeland here from North Dakota, are talking about an amendment to the Constitution called the Regulation Freedom Amendment, which would require that Congress approve major new federal regulations. And I wonder if any of you had comments about that.
Thanks, Ramon. Appreciate your work over the years on this issue. I think in order to inspire the which is really, we have to recognize that that's the necessary ingredient that we need. We need a solution that's as big as the problem. And the regulatory abuse is a problem, but I don't think that you, with that issue by itself, you will inspire the grassroots to rise up and say, we've got to take this country back. And so I think that the application that we've drafted, that amendment would be germane on the floor of the convention. But it's part of the overall process. The overall process is reining in the abuses of power in Washington, D.C. That version requiring Congress to approve all regulations, I would require them to approve all regulations, not just major regulations, because all legislative authority is vested in the Congress of the United States. And so, but those are the details you work out on the floor of the convention. So we need to have a rule of germaneness that our mission is to fix Washington, D.C. We're here to rein in Washington, D.C. You can see the technical language that Rob and I put together to accomplish that objective in the call, the application for the convention. So, but we've got to inspire the public, and the public are inspired by stopping the spending, stopping the debt, stopping the invasions of our freedoms. And if we have a big enough solution, we can get a big turnout of the people. Yeah.
Thanks, Roman. This may be a good opportunity to just make a general point about applications. You sometimes have had applications from the states which call a convention for a specific amendment, specific wording, and simply say that this convention must vote on this particular amendment up or down, nothing else. The message that we get from the courts is pretty clear that you can't do that. On the other hand, there are those who argue that a convention cannot be limited, that for whatever reason it's called, it has to have the right to consider anything it wants to. Well, that's not accurate either. How conventions were handled during the founding era and after was that each convention was given a problem or a series of problems and told to work out innovative solutions to that for further action. And that's essentially what this application does. It says we've got a problem, and the convention can consider a range of solutions to solve that particular problem. And obviously the amendment that Roman mentioned in his question would be in order, would be one of those possible solutions.
Next question.
Debbie Lesko, legislator in Arizona. We have quite a large constituency of John Birch Society people in our state, and they're very concerned about a constitutional convention. And the things that Bob said when he got up and spoke were very helpful. My question is, are those on your website, just step by step, to address some of the fears that have been put forth?
Our website is 1 day old. We've hired staff. This is a new launch project. This is just getting going. So, but Rob has written about this. He's got published law review articles. We'll provide links to that, with author's permission and so on.
Well, here's an immediate solution.
Well, the immediate solution is this.
Right here in the ALEC Article 5 handbook. In the back there are a series of appendices, including things like sample applications. And you will find one appendix, Appendix C, answers to criticisms. And it lists the questions, the specific questions that groups like John Birch Society opposed to the convention provide to their members, so that those members can take them to legislative hearings and say, can you answer these questions? So all the questions are listed here, together with all the answers.
The other thing I would like to say about Rob's earlier comment was it's really important that the applications be as uniform as possible. We avoid all kinds of problems. I mean, Florida passed an application for a balanced budget amendment recently that is so idiosyncratic that it won't be aggregated with any other state's application for a balanced budget amendment. It's ineffective, totally ineffective. The only thing that's going to be effective and is certain is if rather than all of us doing our own thing and writing this little nuance and that little nuance, you can put in the whereas parts of it, whatever you want. That doesn't matter. Be it therefore resolved. When it starts that point and from then on, it's incredibly important that the states adopt as close to uniform language as possible, so that there's no doubt that can be aggregated. So if we have 34 states that pass identical language on an exact the operative language of an application, the chances for successful litigation of that are essentially zero. And so we need to make sure that we produce a result that's going to work. And doing your own little legislative process and your own idiosyncratic thing, this isn't the time for that. There are other places. We're going to give you that power for all legislative things, all domestic policy from now on. But we got to work together and have common language for the applications for the convention.
Okay, I knew this was going to happen. We would get to the end here, and we wouldn't have time for everything. We've got time for a couple more quick questions and quick answers, and then there will be another workshop in here at 3:15, so we can't go over too much. But there is a follow-up on Saturday that I'll cover in a couple of minutes. So let's start with the gentleman in the back. He's been standing here.
Thank you. Vito Harvey, area representative, state of Idaho. I'm concerned about the Supreme Court's interpretation. We're all relying on the law. We're all relying on the final arbiter of the law. And I'm just wondering whether the convention will have any power to address the issues that would be presented to the Supreme Court if we were to try and change the structure of the Supreme Court, or at least the way that they interpret. Much of our problems stem from Supreme Court interpretations. Whether or not the Supreme Court relies on previous precedent, as we found they didn't do it all in the New York City prayer case. So the question is there a provision within the convention of the states to address how the Supreme Court is dealing with those laws that are being passed and how they're being applied?
One of the proposed amendments that Mark Levin has proffered would deal directly with that subject. And Levin's got some really interesting ideas that are worthy of debate and worthy of consideration. One of the ideas in the package of amendments that I've drafted up that would cure part of the problem is it would give standing to every state legislator in the country to litigate any violation of the U.S. Constitution, and it could not be dismissed under the political question doctrine or lack of Article 3 standing. And so doing a few things like that are all germane and possible to fix the problem. But the Supreme Court today can pretend it's obeying the Constitution and its interpretations. We will remove any ability that they have to pretend that they're doing that. And if we can do that, I think it changes. I've been reading a lot of detail in the Supreme Court about their great constitutional crisis of the court packing era, which scared them to death. If we come after them, they're going to change, because their number one rule is preserve the Supreme Court. And if they think that their own interpretations are going to be the source of them losing power, I mean, for one thing I would do is I would make it have like the court of the European Court of Justice. We should have 50 Supreme Court justices, and they should be appointed by the state legislatures. And they meet in panels. Take away the federal government's ability to appoint them. If you start even talking about stuff like that, they're going to straighten up and fly right. They're going to save their own backsides.
Next question. Front mic.
Thank you, Kevin. Question for Mike or anyone who would like to ask it. First of all, a quick comment, and I think we can also remove the fear of a runaway convention rather than just answering it, which might be a quicker path, but that's a discussion for another, maybe Saturday. My question is, Mr. Farris, you mentioned earlier, you ticked off a number of examples of how you propose or you would argue, and I agree with you, that the Constitution is currently not being followed. And you may have partially answered this question in your comments you just made. What is to say that if we do what is being advocated and described here, and I've been working in the trenches on some of these ideas for a number of years, that the Constitution, the changes this convention makes to the Constitution will indeed be followed, and what mechanism do we have, other than the court, if there is one, to ensure that they will be?
The greatest thing that we can achieve out of a convention is if they mess it up again, we call another convention. And if they know that this is a realistic process, that the states can correct Washington, D.C., if they abuse it, we just keep calling it. So if the Supreme Court messes up, okay, let's abolish it. You know, if they're going to ignore the Constitution, we abolish the Supreme Court and figure out some other way to settle the disputes. And so we have to validate the power of the states to control the federal government. That's the biggest accomplishment of all. And if we do that, we will scare Washington, D.C. to death. And I think that they will not be nearly so cavalier to go and abuse their power once they realize that this threat is real.
Professor Natelson.
Just to pick up from where Mike said, you can make a good argument, we only have to do this once. that once this part of the Constitution, once this check and balance is revivified, you're going to see a different dynamic in Washington, D.C. But let me address specifically your question, because it often is phrased like this. Gee, they're not following the rest of the Constitution. What makes us think that they would follow any amendments? I examined the history of this, and fortunately, what does happen once an amendment is passed, often as a result of grave political disputes, is that the amendment is thereupon followed. The process of amending the Constitution is a great political event requiring supermajority approval of the American people. I mean, nobody really has, for example, the 22nd Amendment, which limits the president to 2 terms, nobody has seriously tried to break that recently the way they've broken, let's say, the Commerce Clause. So no provision of any law lasts forever, and it's always subject to erosion and breakdown. But generally, the history is pretty good. A corrective amendment gets passed, and we've had a number of such corrective amendments, and they tend to be honored for maybe 100 years. That's a pretty good investment.
One final quick question. I believe we'll have to go to the back, Mike.
Great, thank you. Henry Kriegel from Montana. We tried a resolution in our state Senate, sponsored by the current Senate Majority Leader, calling for a convention that you had outlined here, Rob, and it failed, largely to the fact that grassroots activists are really divided on it, and they're mostly opposed to it due to the reasons this lady mentioned earlier. So we have some of the greatest minds, I think, behind this initiative, and we might have the best paper here. But if we would have, if we could win the war with white papers, we would have won this a long time ago. So the question is what are we going to do to educate and train people with credentials and those who are non-credentialed, who are activists, to understand the nuances of these arguments, so that they're persuasive and can overcome the fears that are being generated by groups like the John Birch Society, who have many friends among them. So what is the plan to really get out there in the grassroots to communicate and overcome the opposition within our own coalitions?
The short answer is we're going to do the same kind of thing we've done in the homeschooling world. We're going to train an army of grassroots activists to do this, and we're going to show up. I mean, I will plan on coming to as many states as possible and testifying. Rob will be available to come to some states and testify. We can bring other people online to help, and we'll train other lawyers that can do this and testify. But the best thing you're going to have is an educated citizenry. And we'll use online techniques, we'll use live techniques, we're going to network. You are going to have, usually it's 100 or 200 opponents. You're going to have in Montana I remember turning out 4,000 people to a legislative hearing in Montana about 20 years ago on a homeschool thing. We'll do it again. Sure.
You know, Henry, and having been so intimately involved in the Tea Party movement, and by the way, thank you for Montana, you know what it means when the Army comes out. And one of the things that we have here that's so unique is a moment in history. We don't get these very often. But you've got Mark Levin, who is one of the biggest megaphones in the conservative movement, who has changed his position from afraid of a runaway to writing a full book about calling for an Article 5 convention. Levin will also be launching that book on Hannity next week with a 1-hour special. So you've got Hannity engaged. Those two guys engage with Limbaugh regularly. There is going to be a very big voice on the right educating people day in and day out on the radio and television why this is important, why it's safe, and why it is the solution. I think that makes a very different situation.
I'm going to violate the rule I set, and one final comment, Dave Bidoff, with
yes.
the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force.
Yeah, two quick things. First of all, ALEC has a fantastic new piece of model legislation. It was approved in January. It was passed by Indiana, and it stops a runaway convention by recalling, killing the vote, an illegal vote, and punishing them, and in fact putting them in jail. And it's a really good piece of legislation. Highly recommend it. Go in tandem with the application. And the second thing is, the idea that all of you are invited to come to an event that is decidedly not C3. The C4 component of this, it will be discussed Saturday morning. Registration at 8 o'clock in the Chicago room. You're all welcome. Thank you.
And that is the Article 5 Caucus organizational meeting. You are all very much encouraged to not only come to that, but join the caucus if you're a state legislator, or get your state legislator to join that caucus. It's simply meant to be one more arm to encourage people to know the right thing and to do the right thing. If you thought you came into this workshop to just spend an interesting hour, you were wrong, because we are here to save the Republic, and I believe we have that opportunity. Thank you very much.
If I could just say a couple of housekeeping things. Mark is going to be here for the entire week. I will be here through tomorrow afternoon. Rob will be here for a little while. If you want to talk to us one-on, please come up and talk to us now or at another point in time. Go to conventionofstates.org for further information. We're going to be populating that with more data on a regular basis. We just hired new staff this week. We're going great guns. And if I can help you in any way, please get a hold of me. My business card is inside of your booklet here. It's just Michael Farris at conventionofstates.org, or .com, excuse me. So please get a hold of us. We'll work with you. We'll help you. Let's save the country.
Thank you.